In 2007, Nokia made 1 billion phones. Let that sink in. 1 billion phones. More than any company in history. They controlled 40% of the entire global mobile market. They had the engineers, the factories, the brand, and the cash. In developing markets across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Nokia wasn't a luxury. It was the first phone millions of people ever owned. By every measure, Nokia was untouchable. 5 years later, they sold their entire phone division to Microsoft for $7.2 billion. A company that didn't even make phones. So what happened? How does the world's most dominant tech company collapse in less than a decade? And why did nobody inside Nokia, with all their resources, all their talent, all their data? See it coming? This is the story of the greatest fall in tech history. Welcome to the Founder Files. Nokia didn't start as a phone company. They started in 1865. Yes, 1865, as a paper mill on the banks of the Nokian Virta River in Finland. For the next century, they made rubber boots, industrial cables, and eventually consumer electronics. By the 1980s, they were making everything from televisions to computers. Then in the early 1990s, Finland deregulated its telecom industry. Nokia saw the opening and pivoted hard into mobile phones. It was a bet that could have failed spectacularly. Instead, it changed everything. The Nokia 1011, launched in 1992, was one of the world's first mass-market GSM phones. It wasn't pretty, it was heavy, boxy, and looked more like a walkie-talkie than a phone, but it worked. And people bought it. What followed was one of the most remarkable runs in corporate history, the Nokia 3310, the 8110, made famous by the Matrix, the 6600, the N95, each generation better than the last. By 2003, Nokia was the 5th most valuable brand on the entire planet, ahead of Disney, ahead of Mercedes-Benz, ahead of almost everyone. At their peak, Nokia employed 132,000 people across 120 countries. They had their own research labs, their own chip designs, their own maps, their own app store, before Apple even thought of one. They were so far ahead, it seemed impossible that anyone could catch them. And then, on January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco.
Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products. The first is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. The audience laughed, assuming he meant 3 separate products. Jobs paused, smiled, and said, "These are not 3 separate devices, this is one device."
The iPhone. Nokia's leadership watched the announcement, and internally they weren't scared, they were dismissive. Their engineers called the iPhone a toy, and honestly, they had a point. Technically, the original iPhone had no 3G. It couldn't send MMS. The camera was average. The battery life was poor. Nokia's flagship N95, which launched around the same time, had GPS, a 5-megapixel camera, and 3G connectivity. On pure specs, it destroyed the iPhone, but Nokia was measuring the wrong thing. They were comparing features. Apple was selling a feeling, a completely different way of interacting with a device, a pocket computer that made calls, not a phone that browsed the internet. Nokia confused technical superiority with market relevance. It's one of the most expensive mistakes in business history. Here's what Nokia fundamentally missed. The iPhone wasn't competing with their phones, it was making their phones irrelevant. The moment people experienced a touchscreen with real apps, fluid browsing, and a proper music player, the Nokia experience felt like stepping back in time. But the real problem was deeper than the product. It was the culture. By 2007, Nokia had become a massive bureaucracy. Over 100,000 employees, dozens of competing internal divisions. A management culture where delivering bad news upward was career suicide. Engineers who raised concerns about touchscreens or software architecture were quietly ignored. Leaders who challenged the strategy found themselves sidelined.
One former Nokia executive, speaking anonymously years later, admitted, "We knew, we saw it coming, we had the data, but the culture made it impossible to act."
They had the intelligence, they lacked the courage. That is the real tragedy of Nokia. Not that they were blind, but that they could see clearly and still couldn't move. Nokia tried to respond. They weren't sitting still. They invested billions in touchscreen research. They launched the Nokia 5800, their first major touchscreen phone. In 2008, they poured resources into their Ovi app store. They even had touchscreen prototypes years before Apple launched the iPhone that were shelved by management who thought the market wasn't ready. But none of it came together. Their biggest problem was Symbian, their operating system. Symbian was built in the 1990s for a world of feature phones, with small screens, numeric keypads, and limited processing power. Adapting it for the smartphone era was like trying to turn a cargo ship using a bicycle handlebar. Technically possible, agonizingly slow, and never quite right. Meanwhile, Google launched Android in 2008, free, open source, and spreading to every manufacturer on the planet almost overnight. Samsung, HTC, LG, Motorola, they all adopted it immediately. Nokia was now fighting a war on two fronts, Apple from the premium end, Android from every other direction, and they were doing it with a 1990s operating system dressed up in a 2010 body. Their market share began to collapse from 40% in 2007 to 34% in 2009 to 23% in 2010. The numbers told a brutal story. In September 2010, Nokia made a decision that surprised the entire industry. They hired Stephen Elop, a Canadian executive who had been running Microsoft's business division, as their new CEO. He was the first non-Finnish leader in Nokia's 145-year history. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 11 months later, Elop sent an internal memo that became one of the most famous documents in corporate history. He described Nokia as a man standing on a burning oil platform in the middle of the North Sea, facing a choice between jumping into freezing water or burning to death. "We are standing on a burning platform," he wrote, "and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior." The memo leaked within hours. The world read it. Nokia's stock dropped 14% in a single day. What came next was Elop's most controversial decision. Instead of adopting Android, free, proven, already dominating the market, he announced a full partnership with Microsoft. Nokia's smartphones would run Windows Phone exclusively. Nobody understood it. Many suspected a conflict of interest given Elop's Microsoft background. Some called it the Trojan horse strategy, a deliberate move to position Nokia for acquisition. The conspiracy theories never fully went away. Windows Phone had fewer than 100,000 apps. Android had over 400,000. Developers weren't interested in building for a third platform, with no guaranteed user base. The partnership was dead before it launched. By 2012, Nokia's phone revenue had collapsed by 40% year over year. They were burning through cash. Layoffs began. Tens of thousands of people losing their jobs. In September 2013, Microsoft acquired Nokia's phone division for $7.2 billion. Elop returned to Microsoft as part of the deal, leading many to believe the acquisition had been the plan all along. 14 months later, Microsoft wrote down $7.6 billion, more than they paid, and laid off 25,000 Nokia employees. They discontinued most Nokia phone lines entirely. The Nokia phone story was over. So, what do we actually learn from all of this? The first lesson is about the difference between being good at what you do and being relevant. Nokia was extraordinarily good at making phones, but the market stopped caring about phones. It started caring about pocket computers. Being the best in a category that no longer matters is not an advantage, it's a trap. The second lesson is about culture-eating strategy. Nokia's leaders weren't stupid, they had access to the same data everyone else had. They could see what Apple was doing. They chose not to act because the culture rewarded caution and punished honesty. When the people closest to the problem can't speak truth to power, organizations make decisions in the dark. And the third lesson is the hardest one. Disruption rarely looks dangerous until it's too late. The iPhone in 2007 was slower, simpler, and less capable than Nokia's flagship phone, but it was pointing in the right direction. Nokia was pointing in the wrong one. Every company you admire today, Apple, Google, Nvidia, Samsung, they are all one blind spot away from becoming the next Nokia. The question isn't whether disruption is coming. It always is. The question is whether you're honest enough with yourself and your team to see it while you still have time to act. Nokia wasn't, and the world moved on without them. That's the Founder Files for this week. If this story made you think differently about how companies rise and fall, hit subscribe and join us every Saturday for more stories from the people and companies who shaped our world. Stories of ambition, genius, betrayal, and reinvention from every corner of the globe. Hit the bell, leave a comment below. I'd love to know, which company do you think is today's Nokia? Who's sitting on a burning platform right now without realizing it? We'll see you next Saturday.